Hi, thank you for inviting me to talk here today at the Visual Media Arts Workshop. My name is Patricia Routh and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Leicester in the Media and Communications Department. Like many of the other scholars that this workshop has brought together for you, I'm also currently researching selfies, to be specific, the gendered performativities of selfie production, both patriarchal and alternative production. Because of my research interest, part of what I'm researching with selfies relates to the theories of cinematic gaze, specifically male gaze, and how the visual tropes or dominant cultural discourse of society influence people who take selfies of themselves. In fact, the theories of cinematic gaze, which have been around since the 70s, help to illustrate that culturally conditioned ways of seeing and accepted cultural signifiers influence a lot more of our society than just selfies. At a very subconscious level, cinematic gaze proposes it influences how we believe we should behave as men and women, our identities as we present them to the world. But more specifically, it subconsciously influences our expectations, desires, and beliefs of how others should behave and look. So this is what I'm going to speak about today at the Visual Media Workshop, the cinematic gaze, Mulvey, and learning to see. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to give an overview of the origins of cinematic gaze theory, briefly discussing the power dynamic of gaze posited by Michel Foucault, ending with a description of the feminist film theory known as male gaze, theorized by Laura Mulvey. The concept of gaze was popularized by this man, French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Jacques Lacan, who has been called one of the most controversial psychoanalysts since Freud. As a psychoanalyst first, he claimed to be influenced primarily by Freud's work. However, his work heavily overlaps with post-structuralism theories that argue that cultural conditions and the study of underlying social structures like language or visual media, that they are subject to biases. The post-structuralist approach would argue that you have to understand the systems of power that exist at the time to study both the structure itself and the systems of knowledge that produce the structure. For example, those in powerful positions in the process of defining the ideological preferences that people hold. So even after more than 40 years after writing his psychoanalytical ideas on gaze, which, to add to the confusion, change over the course of his life, his theories about gaze as they relate to film theory have often been fiercely debated about what he actually meant. But since we need to move quickly towards explaining male gaze, I will only touch on the basic agreed upon principles of cinematic gaze as influenced by Lacan's theory of gaze. I will come back to the post-structuralism a bit when I discuss Foucault. So, Lacan, early on in his career, relates the idea of gazing to his concept known as the mirror stage. He believed that all humans as infants must go through the mirror stage in order to recognize themselves as an individual. However, well before they begin to speak, understand language, and understand what he refers to as the symbolic order. For Lacan, the symbolic order is the social world of linguistic communication, knowledge of ideological conventions, and the acceptance of the societies and laws. Once a child enters into language and accepts the rules and dictates of the society they live in, it is able to cooperate with others. So Lacan says, prior to the symbolic order, we have the mirror stage. This is where the subject appears to achieve a sense of dominance by seeing themselves in the form of their ideal, or specifically ideal ego, to use Lacan's term. By viewing oneself in the mirror, the subject at the mirror stage begins their entrance into this symbolic order, or culture and language, by establishing their own biases through an imaginary desired image reflected to them in the mirror. An image that the subject can adjust, reconstruct, based on new biases fed to them through the symbolic order throughout their life. So in other words, an aspirational image of oneself can be filled in by others who we want to emulate in our adult lives, role models, love objects, celebrities, anyone that we set up as a mirror for ourselves can become our aspirational selves, and this can evolve and change. Gaze, in Lacan's later work, refers to the uncanny sense, a Freudian concept originally that has been used more recently in the field of robotics to describe the eerie unease sense we may feel around so-called lifelike robots, known as the uncanny valley. I use this as an example as I feel it might help clarify a bit Lacan's later idea of gaze, a bit, perhaps. The uncanny valley actually refers to a position along a chart of replicated human likeness, where a simulated human looks and acts nearly human, but not exactly like a human. When this point is reached, the hypothesis suggests that the first response within humans is to feel uncomfortable and even feel extreme fear towards the simulated human. So, using this same Freudian concept of the uncanny, Lacan writes that the object we gaze at is somehow gazing back at us. This uncanny feeling of being gazed at by what we look at affects us in the same way as the uncanny valley hypothesis, causing us to feel uneasy, uncomfortable, and fearful. This uncanny sense is reminding us of our lack of knowledge of the symbolic order or cultural conventions of the object we are looking at on the screen. We want to believe that we are in control of our fantasy of the gaze. However, the feeling of power is lost by the fact that we become aware of materiality, of the materiality of the object, or of the existence or of its potential to have the real, as Lacan calls it, which refers to our infant awareness or primordial animal need, from which we have been forever severed by our entrance into the symbolic order of our culture. It is this concept that has been particularly influential with the feminist film theorist, namely Laura Mulvey, and the concept of male gaze. But we will come back to this when I talk about male gaze. For now, we're moving on to Foucault, as I feel it's important to mention the influential work that his influential work has had on male gaze. Michel Foucault is a French philosopher and social theorist, and he's considered a post-structuralist, although I guess he rejected that title. And his theories elaborate upon Lacan's work and address more of the relationship between the power and knowledge and how they are used as a form of social control that teach us how to see. Foucault extends the concept of gaze into the realm of surveillance, arguing that the gaze becomes the perfect medium for spreading domination. Power becomes manifest in a disembodied gaze, and this gaze views even the most insignificant aspects of life as a method of controlling. He first observes this in medicine, in the clinical gaze, that becomes the speaking eye that surveys and explains everything. The eye becomes the source of clarity for the powerless, the ill, and is equated with knowledge, which in turn is equated with power. The medical gaze is soon extended to power relations, where everyone becomes objects of an overarching gaze, whose inspection functions ceaselessly. The gaze is on alert everywhere. Order is established not through steel bars, but through the submission of everyone to an omnipresent and impenetrable gaze. We are seen, yet cannot see. In this famous chapter of Foucault's seminal book, The Order of Things, Foucault examines the painting Las Meninas, The Maids of Honor, painted in 1656 by Spanish painter Diego Velázquez. He observes that the painting represents the artist himself at work on a large canvas, only the back of which is visible. In the front center is the Princess Margarita and her maids. On a mirror hung in the background are the faces of the king and the queen looking straight back into their reflection, or possibly looking at us, the viewers. Aside from this reflected image, the king and the queen are not visible to us. The painting evokes the exchange of looking. We can look at the painting, and it, in effect, looks back at us. The value of Velázquez's painting for Foucault lies in the fact that it introduces uncertainties in visual representation. Foucault finds that Las Meninas was a very early example and critique of the supposed power of representation to confirm an objective order visually. Throughout the history of art and in the contemporary world of film and advertising, images of women have been represented in ways that emphasize their status as sexual beings or maternal figures. In 1975, filmmaker and writer Laura Mulvey published a groundbreaking essay about images of women in classical Hollywood cinema called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. She used Lacanian psychoanalysts to propose that the conventions of popular narrative cinema are structured by a patriarchal unconscious, positioning women represented in films as objects of a male gaze. Mulvey argued that Hollywood cinema offered images geared towards male viewing pleasure, which she read with certain psychoanalytical paradigms, including scopophilia and voyeurism. The concept of gaze is fundamentally about the relationship of pleasure and images. In psychoanalytical terms, scopophilia refers to the pleasure in looking, and in exhibitionism, in the pleasure of being looked at. Both of these terms acknowledge the ways in which reciprocal relationships of looking can be sources of pleasure. Voyeurism is the pleasure in looking while not being seen and carries a more negative connotation of a powerful, somewhat sadistic position. The idea of the camera as a mechanism of voyeurism has often been discussed with this theory, since, for instance, the position of viewers of cinema can be seen as voyeuristic. They sit in a darkened room where they cannot be seen in order to watch the film. In Mulvey's theory, the camera is used as a tool of voyeurism and sadism, disempowering those before its gaze. She and other feminist film theorists who pursued this line of thinking examined certain films of classic Hollywood cinema to demonstrate the power of male gaze. Male gaze posits that women become the objects of desire in traditional Hollywood film and have been reduced to passive screens for the projection of male fantasies. But on the other hand, male desire for the dominance of this specific gendered look, in fact, continually is undercut by this uncanny, the experience when they view the illusion of cinematic reality. According to Mulvey, the blank space between the frames is comparable to the ever-threatening real or uncanny that is conditioned for us to avoid because of the potential deviation from the dominant structure in society, and it deviates from the fantasy of our reality. So hopefully this has been helpful or provided at least some food of thought for you today. It has been immensely helpful for me to put this talk together and helpful for my research. So I thank you again for inviting me.